Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to our viewers, wherever you may be. I hope all of you are doing well in spite of the pandemic situation we are in. My name is June Colmenares, Commander of the Knights of Rizal, Aloha Chapter, and I will be your MC for today's event. Um, As chapter commander, I would like to take this opportunity to welcome all of you to our 7th lecture in our Rizalian lecture series. The main objective of the Knights of Rizal is to educate people on the life, works, and ideas of our national hero. And this lecture series is one way by which the chapter endeavors to help achieve this aim. Before we proceed, I would like to remind our participants that the lecture will be for 1 hour and will be immediately followed by a response from a reactor. There will be a Q&A session after the reaction. For the Q&A session, you can either write down your questions in our chat space or you can ask them directly. We will read the written questions first before we entertain live questions. This lecture is being recorded and will be available on YouTube later on. Finally, I would like to remind everybody to mute your microphones when you are not speaking. Thank you. I now call on Sir Raymond Leongson, Area Commander for Hawaii, to introduce our guest speaker. Sir Raymond?
Let's see, unmute. Okay. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us in this 7th virtual Rizalian Forum. We are really very lucky, fortunate, and happy that we have this time Dr. George Aseniero as our speaker. Dr. Aseniero is a political scientist and a well-published author who did research primarily on world system studies. He worked for the University of the United Nations in Geneva and Tokyo, in charge of research projects on development and regional studies for Latin America, Europe, and Asia. He pursued postgraduate studies in development economics and doctoral studies in international relations at the University of Geneva, and is a retired professor of political science at the University of the Philippines. Dr. Aseniero is known widely as the grandson of one of Rizal's favorite students in Dapitan, who later became governor of Zamboanga. Among his works on Rizal are Games of the Great Powers, Rizal and Imperialism, and From Cadiz to La Liga, the Spanish context of Rizal's political thought. Fellow knights, friends, guests, we are proud and happy to present to you Dr. George Aseniero.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm talking to you from the Pitan, just mentioned a while ago. It's not the most advanced cyber city in the world, so I'm always worried about technicalities, technical problems coming up when we're talking, so I hope nothing of this kind will happen in the next 2 hours. I'll go straight to the lecture. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, so there you have the topic, results of geopolitical analysis and its implications for the national struggle. I'm going to discuss this in 4 parts. The first is geopolitics in a time of world economic crisis. This is more or less myself talking. I'm contextualizing results analysis. I'm giving a theoretical and historical background for what Rizal did, which is then number 2, which is his own geopolitical analysis, as he wrote it in various writings, primarily the essay Filipinas dentro de 100 años. Then the third part will be Rizal's own understanding of the implications of his own analysis for the national struggle, which at that time, you know, was very much in a revolutionary mode or revolutionary mood yet before it went into the revolutionary mode. And the fourth is no longer Rizal. It's a discussion that I'd like to open up if we have time. It's really more speculative and counterfactual history, which is more or less discussing what could have happened, what were the possibilities that could have been pursued following Rizal's geopolitical analysis. So that's what I intend to cover in the next hour. So the first one, geopolitics in a time of world economic crisis. Now, geopolitics, of course, is the politics at the global level, politics at the global level. It's the politics of nation states as they pursue what Bismarck called realpolitik, or what the French, since Cardinal Richelieu, called raison d'etat. You know? It's the pursuit of the national interest of countries vis-a-vis each other. And of course, the concept or the content of national interest is defined by the internal politics of those states, domestic sources of geopolitics in relation to the other states of the interstate system. So that's geopolitics, politics of foreign policy and alliance systems and conflicts and so forth and so on. And my point here is that that period of history when Rizal was doing this analysis, which was in 1889, 1890, all the way to 1896, was executed, was a time of world economic crisis. That was the crisis of 1870, 75, and went on till 1890, 96. So it draws, what I want to say here is that there is a strong parallelism between his time and ours, because we are also experiencing a very serious world economic crisis. So I want to take off from this quote from Paul Krugman, well-known, of course, economist and New York Times columnist. This is from one of his New York Times articles. I found it interesting and useful for launching my discussion, because he says here in one paragraph that there have been 3 depressions. He calls them depression, I would call it crisis. 3 crises or 3 depressions since the last century and now. The first one, he says, was in the 19th century that followed the Panic of 1873. The second one was the crisis of the 20th century that followed the crisis of 1929. And now he says that we are now in the period of a 3rd depression, 3rd crisis. And so what I will be doing is, what I will be discussing is that what Rizal thought of the geopolitics of his time, of the 19th century, has quite a bit of relevance to our period of today. Now, remember those highlighted letters there, parts? That is what I would then put here. I would discuss this in relation to Kondratiev long waves of the world economy, because as I will show in the next slide, the development of the world economy since the 18th century to the present has shown an oscillating pattern, a pattern of long waves, characterized by a period of growth, expansion, and then peaking at a point, and then declining, going down into a depression and going to a crisis before it starts to go up again. See, and what Paul Krugman was talking about was this crisis of 1870 to 75, which is this one here, right? Or rather this one here, following an expansion of the world economy that started in 1850 and so on. Now, I'd like to draw your attention to that blue line below. That is Rizal's lifetime, starting, of course, in 1861 when he was born. And you notice that at that time, the world economy was going up, expanding very rapidly. It was a tremendous period of history of capitalism. Following the Industrial Revolution, this was now the second Industrial Revolution of railroads and so on. And then it peaks there and then starts to go down into crisis. And that is exactly where Rizal was doing his analysis at that time when the world economy was a deep crisis before it took off again. Now, this is, of course, an idealized graph. It's a sine function. So it looks very beautiful as a wave. And one would say, oh, reality is not like that. Well, actually, reality is very much like that, as I can show here in the next slide, which is showing here in actual indicators, quantitative indicators, just to give you, to show to you why that wave function is correct, which is the blue one, plotted against the red line here, which is a particular indicator of US wholesale prices. And of course, as you can see, the pattern of this indicator is very much involved, or very much parallel to the synthetic, blue line, which is the combination of so many other indicators resulting in this function here. And that's very similar to this one. So you see, this is just to facilitate our discussion. Right? Okay, now another indicator I want to use, which is of direct relevance to our discussion, is this one, which is the price of sugar. You see, again, you see that you have the did I touch anything wrong here? Can you see it still? So you have here the price of sugar going up and going down, going up and going down. And again, you see that in the 1850s, 1860s, it was going up, and then it starts to come down. Now, this explains very much in the Philippines, the rise of the middle class in the Philippines, the rise of the families like the Rizal family, for one, and so many others, who were engaged in agriculture for export. The price of sugar precisely shows why in the early years of 1850s, 1860s, even up to the 1870s, people were earning a lot of money, and the Rizal family was feeling comfortable enough that they could send their son to Europe to study. They could finance the study. But once there, the price of sugar started to come down. A little bit late in the Philippines, it started to come down in the 1880s, 85 or so, precisely when Rizal was in Europe, and giving his poor brother Pasiano a very difficult time of supporting him, because the price of sugar was going down, and you can see it really went down here. Now that triggered a lot of political, socioeconomic reactions in the Philippines, precisely because many of the families who were planting sugar on friar lands that they were leasing from the Dominicans, for instance, were having a difficult time paying the rent because the price of sugar was so low. And therefore, one kind of problem leads to another. And in this case, failure to pay 1 year's rent results in a higher rent the next year because penalties are added and so forth and so on. So this contributed to the long simmering agrarian problem between the lessees and the lessors, between the farming families and the landowners. The same thing happened in Cuba, because Cuba was even more dependent on sugar than the Philippines was at that time. I think at that time, Cuba was actually the world's biggest producer of sugar. And of course, when the price of sugar was coming down, then there was tremendous socio-economic pressure on everybody, making life very, very difficult. And it became even more difficult when Spain suddenly canceled, for a variety of reasons having to do with the crisis again, suddenly canceled, invalidated an agreement, a treaty with the US, a US trade agreement. They were not going to send sugar anymore, so that cut down the export earnings of Cuba, because the US was the biggest buyer of sugar. At the same time, that it made it very difficult for the Cubans to survive, because they were also very much dependent on imports from the US. You see how well connected, how well entangled was the Cuban economy to the US economy. So that, again, that triggered a revolutionary mood of the people. And in 1895, they revolted in Spain. Right? So everything here I'm sharing has to do with the world economic crisis. Now, so just here, I just want to say a little bit about, I just want to discuss a little bit to show that period of Rizal's crisis, the 1873 to 1896 crisis. And, in just a few words, I don't want to get so diverted from the topic, the present crisis, which some people say started in 2007. This is Paul Krugman talking. That's why he said very recent. He started with the Wall Street crash and so on. But other theoreticians go as early as 1973. World systems theory goes back to 1973 as the beginning of this downswing, the B phase of the Kondratiev wave. I'll just talk a little bit about how you would characterize that crisis of the 19th century and compare it a bit to the present. So, of course, there was a generalized contraction, meaning a drop in prices. I mentioned sugar. General deflation, it affected all other commodities across the board. Bankruptcies, can you imagine even the railroad companies of the United States, the Northern Pacific Railroad collapsed, which was in fact the driving industry at that time. There were bank runs. The panic of 1873 actually started in Vienna with a crash of the financial market there. That was, I think, in April of 1873. And in August 1873, it was the crash of New York. It was a crash everywhere else. So, crash of stock markets. Well, in our time, we have stagnation of real wages. They say that real wages have not really gone up since 1973. There's increasing inequality. We all know that from Piketty and all this discussion now of inequality within nations and across nations. We're talking about the debt crisis. The Philippines is one of those very badly affected, but so is the United States. And then you have the financial crisis, Wall Street, the ASEAN, and so on. So these are, how should I say, manifestations of the crisis of our period, comparable to those of Rizal's period. Then you have declining rates of profit, exhaustion of the driving industries. The driving industry at that time was, since the first industrial revolution, commodities, textiles, and so on, and then steel or iron, rather, railroads, and so on. And they just were not profitable anymore, and driving investors to bankruptcies. Well, in our time, the declining rates of profit also means that capital doesn't know where to go. You see, there is excess capital because, of course, when you talk about the contracts, you have a long way before you have a decline, you have an upswing. And in that upswing, there was just so much money to be made, but it was so unequal in its distribution socially. Only the capitalists, and big investors, and big monopolists were making so much money. They had so much excess capital, but they don't have very good prospects for investments. It's a problem of overaccumulation for the rich countries. For the poor countries, it's just the opposite. We need investments, but we don't have capital, right? So that's a problem. And of course, what happens if you have so much wealth, but you cannot invest in industry because it's not giving, it goes to the banks. So that brings us to the problem of financialization, which is something I will go to in a while. Now, the third here is a cluster of, again, symptoms or manifestations of crisis, because companies were crashing, were going bankrupt. The bigger ones gobbled the small ones, and in the end, you have monopolization of capital. The big ones survive and become bigger and bigger and bigger, and the small ones just disappear or get gobbled up. That's true in industry, and that goes through with banks, and then banks teamed up with industry. So this is what you call the industrial finance, industrial finance, monopoly capital. Well, the same thing in our period now, and ours is perhaps even worse because the monopolization of economic growth, wealth, etc., is so severe, as we all know. I wanted to say here that with the exhaustion of the driving industries, of course, in preparation for the next upswing, new industries come up. And in that period of Rizal, the new industries that were coming up were in chemistry, in chemicals, and in electricity, and which country was in the best position to profit from these industries? It was Germany. So Germany was the upcoming economic power of that period. In our period now, the deindustrialization, the old industries, Detroit, the steel industry, the car industry, they're being hollowed out, and you have new industries coming up, computer, cybernetics, and so forth and so on. But the difference is that the new industries that have come up have become extremely monopolized to the extreme that you can even identify entire industries in terms of a person. Bill Gates, Facebook, and a few of these extremely powerful, extremely rich monopolists of the new industries. And financialization, of course, banks don't know anymore what to do. And that goes back to the debt crisis and so on. Now, the fourth one, and then I move to the new topic. The fourth one is that what do you do when things are becoming very bad? So you go out for export. You export your market, your larger market, because your internal market is no longer able to absorb. And the same to do with capital. You take it out, invest. Like the British did with railroads in India. I mean, in India, in Argentina, everywhere else. Export of capital, which means they needed to have control over new territories. And this led, of course, to inter-imperialist rivalry. The old powers and the new powers clashing in competition for territories that they want to exploit, whether it's for the market, for the natural resources, for the labor, or more and more importantly, for military bases. Because now these countries were thinking in geostrategic terms, and they need coaling bases, fueling bases, military bases, and that's the competition there. And this was exactly what Rizal was analyzing as I go on. For ours now, the comparison to that is globalization. I don't have to say anything more about that. That's exactly what has happened since 1973, when because of declining rates of profit in the home countries, capital had to go abroad, relocate. Of course, China is the biggest beneficiary of that global relocation, and it's no wonder that it's also the economy that is rising. It's comparable to Germany in the earlier period. Now it's China, and now we have hegemonic rivalry. This is the stuff of global politics now, the U.S. versus China. So you see how these two periods parallel each other, and that was exactly more or less, as I have put it, how Rizal then proceeded to make his analysis. So now I go to the second part, which is Rizal's geopolitical analysis. Again, to refresh, he began his life when the world economy was on an upswing, and then while he was in Europe, and then in the last years of his life, it was going down, and life was becoming very difficult everywhere. It was also very difficult in Spain, so that you can understand the tension and so on. But I want to draw your attention here to this red green line above. This was the, shall we say, the United Nations system of that time. Of course, it did not exist as an organization, but it existed as a mode of understanding between countries. They call this the concert of Europe, because the European powers after 1815, after the last of the Napoleonic Wars, after a decade, 2 decades of warfare, they thought that we've got to sit down and be more civilized, and let's proceed by diplomatic means and so forth and so on. So that was the concert of Europe. And the idea there was that they were going to work on a concept of a balance of powers. They more or less thought that, you have the power that you have, I have the power that I have, he has the power that he has. Let's keep it that way. Let's not disturb. But when it happens that some country becomes more and more bigger and bigger, stronger and stronger, the others react, so that there is always this balancing of powers amongst countries. I'll give you one example. It is also relevant to Philippine history. In 1868, there was a revolution in Spain when the liberals ousted the Queen Isabella, because they just got fed up with her and the corrupt court and so on, and they sent her off on exile, and the liberals took over. But then they realized that they needed, or at least a stronger group of the liberals thought that they needed a constitutional monarchy. They needed a king, the queen, some monarch, but who would rule, who would reign rather according to the constitution. So it was the British type of constitutional monarchy that they wanted to. So they went around looking for a monarch they could invite to sit on the Spanish throne. And one of those that they first approached was someone from the Hohenzollern dynasty of Prussia. Now, what happened? Even the rumor that the Spaniards were talking with the German, well, Germany was yet a few years, 2-3 years away from unification. Yeah? But just the rumor that the Spaniards were talking with the Prussians and with the Hohenzollern family, the reigning dynasty in Prussia, sent the French on a reaction mode where they were so worried that this would upset the balance of power, because if you have Germany now, if a German monarch is sitting on the Spanish throne, this would upset the balance of power. And in fact, that triggered the Prussian-French War, the German-French War of 1871. which led to the commune and everything and so on. So this is just to tell you how this concept of balance of power works in practice and in theory. Now, Rizal paid very much attention to this concept of balance of power as a mechanism of states balancing each other in his own analysis of the powers that he thought might be interested in the Philippines. Now, this is a map that Rizal drew himself. This is actually his own work. I don't know if it's clear enough on your screen, but it's actually the Pacific Ocean that is in the centerpiece. And that was really his focus. And here, of course, on the west is the United States, and on the east is Asia. He wrote this in French, Océan Pacifique. And you have those islands there, which are, he says, possession des États-Unis. So these were already possessions of the United States at that time. And then he says, this is, I think, Indonesia, and he says this is the possession volante. And then in the China, possession de la France, possession de l'Angleterre, and then, of course, the Philippines, which is possession de l'Espagne. What he wants to show here is that he's already making a map of where the powers are, their domains in the Pacific, and where their interests could clash in the coming years. And then he went on to talk precisely about what we now call imperialism, but he didn't call it that. He used the terminology, the colonial politics of European nations. In another, he says, he refers to it as the British system. I mean, this is what he means, of course, is a system where a powerful country has dominion and economic interests, military, political interests, and so many other countries in the world, and how they play this game, the great game, the game of the great powers. Right? So imperialism, before the word came into usage, which was in the 1890s. Before that, they referred to it as, in the case of the British versus Russia in Central Asia, in Afghanistan, and so on, they called it the Great Game. When the Americans wanted to knock on the door of Japan with a gunboat behind, in that threatening mode, they called it open door policy. When the European powers and Japan had interest on China to carve it up into so many areas of spheres of influence, as they would call it. And of course, Africa, they called it the scramble for Africa. Rizal called it the plunder of Africa, el despojo de Africa. All of that, all of those terms refer to just one thing, which is imperialism, which the Western powers themselves started to use in the newspapers and their policies and so on. They were very proud of talking about imperialism at that time. Imperialism as a word acquired a pejorative meaning later on, much later on, when you have the demonstrators saying imperialism, crush imperialism, bring down imperialism. But at that time, it was official policy of the countries concerned. Now, Rizal, okay, I will be making use here of writings of Rizal, which were left undeveloped. They were notes, that drafts, borradores, that he obviously planned to incorporate into a bigger essay, but did not proceed. But they are very significant in themselves. And this one that I saw in one of his collections, he says this: finally, in the present epoch, colonies are established in territories supposedly free or not belonging to some lord, such as those which are being formed at the center and the eastern and western coasts of Africa, with more honesty and less hypocrisy, in order to exploit the riches that those virgin lands conceal. The old pretext of conversion to Christianity has disappeared. But what he's saying here is that there is a new type of colonialism, if we can still use that word, where the powers are not interested in settling down and imposing their culture on the natives and Christianizing them. In the case of the Philippines, of course, that was exactly the whole justification for holding on to the Philippines. Even at that time when they thought, let's give it up, they convinced King Philip as the second, no, it's needed to save souls, Christianity and so on. The French, less interested in religion and more interested in their culture. They talk about la civilisation, la mission civilisatrice. Well, Rizal says they're not talking these terms anymore. They just go outright and say, I want this and I want that. And if there's somebody else interested in that, then they clash over that. And this is a new thing. And this was really the advent of imperialism, where two countries could almost go to war over an island because of the strategic value of that island. And I'll come to that later. So just to tell you that this was something that Rizal really wanted to focus on, wanted to work on. And these are his notes. But where he actually developed his thoughts was in Filipinas dentro de 100 años, where, as you know, it's a long essay. It appeared in 3 installments in La Solidaridad, 1889-1890. And towards the end, when he's talking already about what could happen if Spain continues to be deaf to the demands of the Filipino people, if they continue to be hard-headed, they continue to be as blind to reality and not seeing history, where the lessons are. He said, well, there will come a time when we will really just have to fight and get our independence. But Rizal, always the brilliant thinker that he was one step ahead. And he was saying, but what would happen? What could happen if we do get independence? We succeed in getting independence from Spain, whether Spain suddenly has a epiphany and says, okay, I give you Filipinos independence, let's not fight over it. Or what was more likely, we revolt and suppose we win and we become independent. What happens then? And then he started to worry, precisely going to that map that we just saw a while ago. So, well, you have these powers that are interested in the Philippines. So he started to look at them one by one. And what interest could they have on the Philippines? And started with Great Britain. And he says, well, I don't think Britain will be interested in the Philippines because, for one thing, she has already so many colonies and dominions all over the world, in Africa, in Asia, South Asia. India itself is a world in itself. Why would she be interested in the Philippines? And you have the small, she has already footholds in Hong Kong, in Singapore. What does she need the Philippines for? And besides, in fact, she would be interested in an independent Philippines because then she can have her economic interests pursued without regard for Spanish, restrictions here and there, because Britain is interested in economics more than anything else. So he thought that Britain would leave things as they are. If you Filipinos are independent now, well, good for you. Let's do business. Rizal probably was thinking of what the famous statement by British Foreign Minister George Canning back in the 1820s, when the Latin American countries revolted against Spain and became independent, with Bolivar and so on, Mexico. And Canning said, Spanish Latin America is free. And if we don't mismanage her affairs, she will be British. And that was exactly what Rizal thought. Well, after all, the Brits are already here. Very much of the sugar that the Rizal family was exporting was very much in the hands of either the Americans or the British. Um, Effectively, Britain, more so than the Americans, was actually the big economic power in the Philippines, even during that last century of Spanish rule. But one thing that Rizal didn't know was that actually the Brits didn't want the Philippines to become independent for political reason, not economic one. For political reason, they thought if the Philippines, a small country on the fringe of Asia, rises and overthrows a European colonial power, that is a very bad example for the rest of the world. And what if the Malays and the Chinese and the Indians and so forth, they will get a very bad example from the Philippines, and they might also entertain these ideas, and they don't want that to happen. So when the Americans went to war against Spain, and they were now deliberating to keep the Philippines or let it go. Big debate in the US, but also a big debate everywhere else. The British were actually sending a communique to Washington saying, keep the Philippines, don't let it go. We want the Philippines to remain in your hands, precisely for that political reason, right? Now, France, again, Rizal says, well, France already has Indochine, and Africa. Why would they be interested in the Philippines? And besides, they just got blooded in their nose by the Germans, in that French Franco-German War of 1870-71. France would not want to disrupt the balance of power in Europe by grabbing another colony, and not a small colony. The Philippines figured big in European affairs, especially for Germany, the third country now that he was considering. Again, Rizal was saying, well, Germany is a very, under Bismarck, who is a very astute and very crafty, but also very cautious, prudent statesman. He will not gamble. He will not risk upsetting the balance of power in Europe by just grabbing the Philippines. But the Germans were very much interested in the Philippines, as I will discuss later on, in those possibilities and so on. Holland. Rizal says, well, the Dutch are just as prudent as the Germans. They already have Sumatra and Java. That's a whole lot of colony, much bigger than the Philippines. Why would they want to go up to the Philippines? They leave us alone. So that was what he thought. He says China. Well, China was, of course, the center of the world for a millennium. Not so long ago, in Chinese time scale, not so long ago, the countries around her were all tributary states, vassals. They were the center of the world. But now they are in decline. So Rizal didn't think that they would pose any threat. He would probably change his view now if we were to consider China in our new crisis, in our period. But at that time, he didn't think that there was anything to worry about China. And besides, he said China itself was being carved into spheres of influence by the European powers. So she is herself a victim of imperialism. Now, Japan. Well, Japan, of course, as we know, escaped from imperialism very cleverly by modernizing very fast and industrializing very fast, and also militarizing very fast. And that was a worry then. And Rizal worried about that. That is, as I will show you later on, even back in 1877, he was worried about Japan. Of course, he knew Japan very well. He stayed there and he loved the country. Of course, he loved the Japanese woman too. But she loved the country and thought very highly of Japan, and talked always about Japan in favorable terms to his students here in the Pitan, talking about how the Filipinos should aspire to be like the Japanese and so on. But he knew that Japan had a problem of overpopulation and lack of natural resources. And those are, of course, reasons for imperialism. But he said, if Japan were to do that, she would grab the one nearest to her, which is Korea. We are too far. So he didn't worry too much. But later on, I will again show to you that he changed his mind about that when he was in the Pitan. Because at that time, exactly what he thought that Japan would grab Korea happened. Right? So finally, the United States. And here is where I think a longer discussion is needed. It is also the longest that he wrote. I think I made can you read it? Because I think I clicked something and now you have these things here. But it says that regarding the great American Republic, whose interests lie in the Pacific, he already says that, but has no share in the plunder of Africa, may one day think of overseas possessions. It is not impossible, since the example is contagious. Greed and ambition are the vices of the strong, and President Harrison manifested something of this sort in the question of Samoa. This is what I was saying about islands in the Pacific, where countries compete with each other and maybe even clash and go to war with each other over an island like Samoa, he says. But, and then this is, those are the things he mentions, which makes him think that maybe yes, but maybe not. He says, but the Panama Canal is not open, number one. Number two, the territories of the United States are not swamped with inhabitants, meaning the United States has no overpopulation problem. So why would she want to send people away from her territory? And third, if she were to pursue this openly, she would not be given free rein by the European powers, who know only too well that the appetite is open to the first bite. That's the balance of power that I was talking about. So he says, the other powers will not allow, because North America would be too troublesome a rival once it gets into the business. And finally, he says, moreover, this would be contrary to her traditions. And what were those traditions? Well, Americans at that time were talking about American exceptionalism, of isolationism. They said, geographically, we're a continent separated by two oceans from that continent of Europe, which is warlike and always the cause of so many problems, always fighting each other. And then on the other side of Asia, we are right in the middle, and we are geographically isolated, and politically we should be too. And then morally, they talked about the exceptionalism. They always thought of the United States as somehow a special creation of God, and so forth and so on. So those were the traditions that Rizal thought were still very much in the minds of the policymakers of the United States. So he says, US interests lie in the Pacific, and he has, of course, these examples. 1875, Hawaii became a US protectorate. 1878, Samoa, they established a coaling station there at Pago Pago. 1889, the year that he started writing his essay, Pearl Harbor was taken over to be used as the US naval base. So now we are in 1890. What could happen in regards to the Philippines? And then again, this is the map, similar to the map that we showed a while ago, but this is the map now of Google. And you have Pearl Harbor, you have Hawaii, you have Samoa. And so the 1890s is where? There's the United States and there's the Philippines there. So he says, it is not impossible. No, it's impossible. Because there is an economic motive there. The United States was very badly hit by the crisis of 1873. And at that time, they were looking for expansion, for markets, for export of capital, just like the other European powers. So there is the economic motive there. And then there is the need for military bases, for coaling stations. Of course, the coaling stations were both for commercial shipping, but also for naval, for military purposes. So he said, it's very clear that the Americans are extremely interested in the Pacific, and they are already competing with the Germans in Samoa, he was saying. But he says, going back to what he says, Panama Canal is not open. Now, question here is, why does this matter to Rizal? Why does he think that so long as Panama Canal is not open, we need not worry about US interests in the Philippines? In fact, the Panama Canal was not even an American project, it's a French project. It was a project of the company that had just done the Suez Canal very successfully. And now said, okay, now we also do this project in the isthmus of Central America, headed by Viscount de Lesseps. So it was a French project, started in 1881. But after 8 years, it was going nowhere. And when Rizal wrote this essay, the French were abandoning the project because they realized that it's not an easy project, unlike the Suez Canal, which was cutting into the desert. This was cutting into a dense tropical jungle. And people were dying because of the yellow fever and malaria, and they ran out of capital. And so the French were not interested in it anymore. But the Americans were very worried when the French started doing it, because they said, this is right in the underbelly of the United States. And you know, the Americans had the Monroe Doctrine, saying that anything, anywhere in the Western Hemisphere is the interest of the United States and the United States alone, in so many words. And that was really the meaning, hands off to the European powers, hands off Western Hemisphere, this is ours. And here come the French doing a project like this, which would connect the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. It would revolutionize world travel. And well, of course, had the French proceeded with that, there could have been conflict. But the French gave it up on purely technical, financial grounds. And the Americans, in fact, took over later on. But at that time, when Rizal wrote it, it was not open, so he said, we do not worry. Then it's not overpopulated, he said. Of course, it was not overpopulated. But in fact, what he didn't know at that time, because it was just being done and the census was reported in 1890, the US Census actually came to the conclusion that there was no room for expansion in the United States. As you well know, the United States began with those 13 colonies on the East Coast, and over the century, and another century, they spread, conquering Indian lands until the last of the Indian land, the Indian Wars, finished exactly in 1890. The Battle of Wounded Knee and all that area, the frontier was all taken over. By 1890, the census said that there was no more frontier line to be detected on the map. A frontier line is technically defined as area where the population density is not more than 2 persons per square mile. That's a frontier line. That means there's land there. Go west, young man, go west. Well, there was no more west because they finished with the coastline of California. And it's, by that definition, overpopulated. There's no more land to be conquered. It conquered everything. So this is actually an empirical fact that Rizal did not know at that time. And then he says the other powers will resist US balance, US attempts. Well, we come to that in a while with Samoa, because in fact, Samoa was the bone of contention between the United States and Germany. And then he says overseas expansionism is contrary to US traditions. Now, 1890 changes everything. I call it here the great geostrategic shift. I have said the census of 1890, no more frontier. But what does that mean? What it means is that where the land ends, the sea begins. And therefore, since you've reached the coast of California, the next frontier line is the Pacific Ocean. And that was exactly what this man, Alfred Thayer Mahan, wrote in a very important book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. It was published exactly in 1890. Of course, Rizal had not read it at that time, but very soon it was a bestseller. And it is said that all the heads of state of Europe read this book and were convinced of what it was saying. It was saying that geopolitical power rests on sea power. He who rules the waves rules the world. And Mahan studied European history from the war between the Romans and the Carthaginians down to the contemporary, almost modern history of the British against Napoleon Bonaparte and so on. It says it is the control of sea power that is the key to geopolitical power. And not only that, it is a combination of military and commercial economic power. So his conclusion then is that the US should think in terms of oceans now, and the US must build up its navy. Now, when he said this, the United States did not really have a navy. There was no need for a navy. It's a terrestrial continent. In fact, in terms of naval indicators, it was 12th in the world. Chile had a bigger navy than the US. But in those 5 years, 1890, 1895, the US built its navy with the latest technology, ironclad ships, steam powered, tremendous guns, and to make it, in fact, the most powerful navy. Well, not quite, there's still the British, but it just became a formidable power, a naval force. And that's why it was very easy for them to fight Spain in Cuba and in the Philippines in 1898. Now, the other thing is that, of course, the US must acquire naval stations in the Pacific. And of course, they already have Samoa and Hawaii and Pearl Harbor. The Philippines is next. And now the US has vital interests in the Panama Canal. This is what Mahan was saying. And you see, the man that Mahan influenced so much was his personal friend, Theodore Roosevelt, who was at that time Assistant Secretary of the US Navy. And it was Theodore Roosevelt who really absorbed this thinking. And he was, of course, being at the Navy, he actually went on and built the US Navy and then was looking for war. He wanted to test the Navy. He says, Mahan is right. We must establish our strategic interests in the oceans. Now, Rizal I came across this borrador, a draft, sin fecha. It was, I put this probably 1890. And I think this could have been, I think that he was thinking of rewriting his analysis in Filipinos dentro de 100 años. And this would have been his main point because it completely overthrows and negates what he has analyzed in Filipinas dentro de 100 años. This is history. Let us read this carefully. Intercontinental politics, this is what he means by geopolitics, la politica intercontinental, marks the first step of a colossus. The United States, departing from its traditions, takes an active part in the colonial politics of European nations. In one word, he says, the US is finished with its exceptionalism and isolationism, and it's now imperialistic. That's what he means by the colonial politics of European nations. So it has been meant to be understood on the latest issue of Samoa, the island where Germany and the United States almost clashed. So has it been declared by President Harrison's message, and so has it been interpreted by the first-ranked colonial powers of Europe. They have been warned by the US. We also want to have our islands out there, and we are going to resist any, we'll fight any resistance. The Germans have met with an obstacle over Samoa, the resistance of a young nation, robust and not inclined to suffer failure. Thus, the old Chancellor, von Bismarck, seeing no usefulness in discord, nor any assurances of success, the Navy is very strong, US Navy, brand new, prefers to seek the resolution of dispute by means of a conference. It's the Berlin Conference. England sees in her brother Jonathan, that was how they called the US at that time, brother Jonathan, the small guy, the young brother, is a worthy rival who follows the same system as she, colonial politics, imperialism, and is naturally alarmed. Yeah, alarmed, but says, well, never mind. I mean, why not, So all these nations who look far, far into the future, dispute amongst themselves the islands of the Pacific, there to establish bases, depot of, that's a termite ate that word, and we don't know also what that word means, but it could also mean so that when some military confrontation happens, the depot of calling stations and so on, military bases. You don't know what he said, but the whole message is there. America is prepared to do anything. And that was exactly what happened in Samoa. There would have been a war between the US and Germany because the US Navy was there and the German Navy was there, and they had their guns poised at each other, and anything could have started a war between them, except that a super typhoon happened, intervened, destroyed so much, and brought some sense to these two powers. And that was when the Chancellor says, hey, get away from the Pacific, come to Berlin and let's talk it over. And they talked it over, right? And so these developments in 1890, to summarize, the Colossus, this is Rizal's own words, Colossus departs from his tradition, so forget about the US tradition of exceptionalism. It is now imperialistic. The US policy is strongly argued by the US for the whole world to hear, and it's understood by the other powers. And the question of Samoa, the US was prepared to go to war. So, in fact, the Berlin Conference, when the Secretary of State, James Blaine, sent his delegates, Casson, Phelps, and Bates, to the Berlin Conference, he says this, and it summarizes Rizal's own thinking. Our interest in the Pacific is steadily increasing. Our commerce with the East is developing largely and rapidly, and the certainty of an early Isthmian transit from the Atlantic to the Pacific, that's the Panama Canal, under American protection, of course, the French should be out, must create changes in which no power can be so directly or more durably interested than the United States. This paragraph, this sentence, is exactly what Rizal analyzed, anticipated, when he wrote that portion in Filipinas de 21 años, and which he then reversed with that paragraph that I read to you. That is the perspicacity, perceptiveness of Rizal's geopolitical thought, geopolitical analysis. He captured exactly that. It's all there. Interest of in the Pacific, the Panama Canal, and our interest will supervene over our tradition. Because after all, as Eric Hobsbawm says, tradition can always be invented. He wrote that book, The Invention of Tradition. So this is exactly, therefore, this was going to be the map. If Rizal had lived, Filipinas would exactly have been there, added to the other possessions that the Americans already had. Now, of course, what was happening here, this is the Panama Canal there, we're talking about the Pacific, but on the Atlantic side, you have another Spanish colony there, which was very, very worried, and that was Cuba. And Jose Marti, very much the soul twin brother of Rizal in so many ways. It's incredible that they did not get to know each other. But Jose Marti said in 1889, the same year that Rizal wrote this, he is also perceiving North America as becoming, as he says here, plutocratic and imperialistic. Now, Jose Marti lived in the United States. He stayed there, he worked there. He was a journalist. He knew America very, very, very well. And he was worried that the Americans were going to get Cuba. But he was not to be deterred because the Cubans, as I mentioned to you earlier, they were really going to go to fight the revolution because they had already started the revolution 10 years earlier. 1895 was a repeat. But Marti was worried. He said Cuba and Puerto Rico would be actually like a bridge, a pivot of America. The Americans would just cross over to capture the rest of Latin America. America would be like Rome. So he said, we must be strong. We, Spanish America. It's very strange here because they're all against Spain as a colonial power, but they identify themselves as Spanish America as a realm, as an area that was distinct from and had interests to protect against the United States, their North American neighbor. And it's always been like that ever since, up to now. So here is the Montun Bridge that Marti was talking about. There's Florida and there's Cuba already. And then they just go step, step, step towards, you know, Venezuela, Bolivia, Mexico, and so forth and so on. You know, what the Mexicans were saying, poor Mexicans, so far from God and so near America. Well, you know, it's just right across. And then here is what Jose Marti says about his own dilemma about the revolution. He says that he understands. He says, I understand the duty of the Cubans of preventing the United States from spreading through the Antilles as Cuba gains its independence and from overpowering with that additional strength our lands of America, our Spanish America, continental Latin America. All I have done so far, and all I will do is for this purpose, to fight for Cuba's independence, but to protect Cuba and Latin America from US imperialism. But this is very important because this is Rizal's dilemma. It had to be in silence and sort of indirectly, since the achievement of certain goals demands concealment. For if proclaimed for what they really are, obstacles so formidable would rise as to prevent their attainment. He was saying, he cannot say to the Cubans, paisanos, the Americans are actually going to grab us. It's a matter of time. We fight now, but we might end up fighting them because they are just waiting. And they will grab us for their own interests. And I know their interests. I know everything that the interests that they have over not just Cuba, but Mexico and Latin America. But he could not say that. How could he say that to the revolutionaries who were only focused on one thing, defeating Spain? And Spain was very serious in defeating the Cuban Revolution. Spain sent 200,000 troops across the Atlantic, the biggest movement of troops across the Atlantic in history until it was repeated during the Second World War, when again so many troops crossed the Atlantic, Second World War, when so many troops crossed the Atlantic from the United States to fight in Europe. So that dilemma of Marti was also Rizal's dilemma. He could not, and I think that's the reason why he did not develop his idea into an essay, because his essay would have said exactly what he said. The United States will get the Philippines, whether we like it or not. Whether Spain is still there or not, they will find reasons to get the Philippines from Spain or from ourselves. if we are already independent? And get it. He could not say that to his Filipino brothers. He could not say that to Spain, because he is saying to Spain, you know, if you don't give us what we want, we're going to revolt. How can he say that? At the same time, he says, yeah, but we're going to revolt, but we're going to have to fight the Americans too. So he kept quiet. And it's a pity because that analysis of his did not spread. And the Filipino revolutionaries did not have any understanding of that thing. Nothing at all. It was a very big, in fact, I would say a big mistake that he did not say so. Because had he, but we don't know really. I mean, again, we talk about that later on if we have time. Anyway, to summarize, since what he wrote in 1890, as you know, in 1892, I'm here to my hometown here in Tapitan. His house, by the way, is not too far away from where I am. In 1893, U.S. Marines overthrew the Hawaiian monarchy, so it was not just going to be a protectorate, it was going to be part of the U.S. Territory as a state. In 1894, Japan attacked China over Korea as anticipated by Rizal. In 1895, China had to sit down with Japan to write the Treaty of Shimonoseki, where she says, I gave up my suzerainty over Korea, you take over. An Asian imperialist power taking over her Asian neighbor for imperialist design and interest. In 1895, Cuba revolts. 1896, here comes Valenzuela to the Pitan saying, we have an organization, we want you to be the leader, we want to revolt. And Rizal says, of course, you know that, where are you going to get your arms and so forth? He says, well, you know, from Japan. Well, you see, when in 1895, the world was shocked that China agreed to this Treaty of Shimonoseki to Japan, Rizal in the Pitan said to his students, and I know this because it's in the memoir of my grandfather, who was one of Rizal's students, as you said in the introduction. Rizal said, now I'm really worried about Japan. And I fear that in half a century, the Philippines will fall to Japanese hands. And his students did not understand a word of what he said, but it kind of escaped from his mind, which was jarring because he was always talking about Japan as a fantastic nation, the Japanese as a fantastic people, and how the Filipinos should emulate the Japanese. And yet he becomes so worried. So can you fault him for telling Valenzuela that the time is not right? And you don't have arms. He could have said, and he might have said so. I don't know how complete is Valenzuela's testimony, right? How complete, because I'm sure Rizal had said more than what he testified. Rizal could have said, don't trust the Japanese. Because he said that, and I will show you later, to Maximo Viola. Anyway, this was the thing. And then, of course, in 1896, Rizal was brought to stand trial. So the implications for the national struggle, for Rizal, it was very, very clear. We can't revolt now, because even if we win, they'll get it from us. He says this in Cien Años. It's a Hegelian kind of philosophy of history. This is very astute. He says, nevertheless, it's not good to stick to the probable. There is a logic, at times imperceptible and incomprehensible, in the workings of history. It is well that both peoples and governments adjust themselves to it. In Spanish, he says, no es bueno fijarse en lo eventual, probable, eventual. Eventual means more than probable. It's something that you wish for, that you hope for, that you wanted to happen, but it's still only a possibility and it might not happen at all. And this is exactly the thinking of the Filipinos. No, we're going to fight, we're going to win, and we're going to have our independence, and we're going to be a nation state. That is lo eventual that Rizal was talking about, that what was in the mind of our Filipino revolutionaries. But he says, no es bueno fijarse en lo eventual, because there is something else. There's a logic in history. But when he talks about logic, he's talking about the logic of the system, of the world system. The world system at that time was that the demands of capital, the demands of the nation state, realpolitik, raison d'etat, capital accumulation, everything conspired towards a certain mode of action on the part of the powerful countries. And you cannot resist that. You have to adjust, meaning you have to think in terms of that. You cannot wish it away. You have to have that in your calculus, right? And so he finally said it when he was, pardon the expression, he was up against the wall. He was now on trial, and he was now talking to the Spanish inquisitors, and he was defending himself. And he was now saying exactly what he thought. And the revolution, or the outbreak, it was not yet a revolution. There was already an outbreak. The Katipunan was discovered, there was a fight. He was now being held responsible for that. And this is what he said in trial. This is the meaning of what I said, that it was essential that we be worthy and united, so that when these developments come to pass, we shall not fall into the hands of Japan, nor England, nor Germany. And the next one, and I'll discuss both. My dream was the prosperity of my country. I knew that through arms, meaning through armed revolution, it was impossible to have liberties and much less independence, because this would not be permitted by the other colonizing nations like England, Germany, etc., meaning, of course, United States. Japan would swallow us up afterwards. El Japón nos comerá, will eat us up, will eat us. That is really the reason why Rizal was against a revolution just then. He was not against revolution per se. He was not saying, no, revolution, I will never. No, he said, this is not the time, because the international conditions did not permit it. And his reason is precisely realpolitik. His reason is world systemic, geopolitical. It has nothing to do with the alleged pacifism that people say, oh, he was a pacifist, he was a poet. This is what Guerrero says, the poet will not have his hands bloodied. Some said, oh, he could not agree with the revolution because his class interest as an ilustrado prevented him from understanding and linking up with the masses. It has nothing to do with that at all. It is this and nothing else but this. And I will show here again, he says, that means that even back in 1887, he was already thinking about it. Already some time ago, in July 1887, certain Japanese personalities were asking me why we were not rebelling, saying they would help us, etc., etc. I answered them that we were fine with Spain and that we did not want to pass from one hand to another. That with Spain, in spite of everything, we are conjoined by 3 centuries, the same religion, and bonds of affection and gratitude, something we don't have with any other nation. They replied, oh, Japan had no interest at all in the Philippines. We are Asians, we are of the same race. I smiled and showed them from history. You see, logic of history. I smiled and showed them from history that their ancestors had not fought the way they did. Now, who was that Japanese? This is interesting what Maximo Viola wrote in his diary, My Travels with Rizal. This was in 1887 when he wrote this. He says, regarding the political question, it is well to bear in mind some of Rizal's ideas regarding the anomalous situation of the Philippines in that era. 1887 was the period. He said that he did not subscribe to any idea of armed revolution. His reason, the only reason, being that a revolution would excite and foment the greedy desire for colonies of other potential powers. He was particularly worried about Japan. He mentioned Japan's proximity to the islands, its greater population, and advanced military equipment. He assured me that if the Philippines overthrew Spanish rule by force and violence, she would only land in the clutches of Japan, where she would have far less chance of ever obtaining her freedom. This was in 1887. Why, in 1887, Rizal, when his second travel back to Europe from the Philippines, as you know, he passed by Japan, stayed there for what, almost a month, I think, or more, I don't know now. Floro would know, Eloy would know, Gemma would know, I just forget. But it was a very fruitful stay. He learned Japanese, and he learned a lot of Japanese culture, and he saw Japan as the rising power. He was already talking about advanced military equipment and so on. Now, in his trip across the Pacific, a co-passenger was a Japanese author named Tetsu, Yoharu Tetsu or something, Tetsu. He was himself a writer, and he spoke no other language than Japanese. Rizal, having lived in Japan for a few days, a few weeks, was already speaking Japanese. So they were speaking Japanese with each other. And all the way across the, first to America, then across the landmass of America, then across the Atlantic. He was with this guy. And this man was talking about Japan, and he could understand, Rizal understood very well that this particular Japanese was a good man, was an Asianist. Asianist meaning that they were now thinking in terms of Asia, what eventually would become the co-prosperity sphere, right? The Japanese were thinking in geostrategic terms. They had Asia in mind. As early as 1887, Tetsu was already saying to Rizal, hey, we should really be together, you know? Well, yeah, of course, together, but under the Japanese. That's how Rizal understood it. And he was right in 1895. And then, unfortunately, he was right in what he said to his pupils exactly 15 years later. Now, Rizal said, this is Viola again, saying, continuing his dialogue. He says, in place of an armed revolution, remember, this is for the moment. This is not forever. This is for the moment when international conditions certainly work against us. He proposed the following plan. Well, continue asking for liberal reforms of the mother country. Build up nationalism, arousing the spirit of Filipino nationalism that was being obstructed by the ruling France. And this is very important, and now I'll come to this. Stimulate the creation of diverse societies and the building of instructive institutions, etc., etc. This is La Liga Filipina, as I will talk about later. Through this method, Rizal believed that the spirit of liberty could be instilled in the Filipino people. You have to understand what freedom is and the responsibility that comes with it, and the sacrifice that one has to be prepared to do for it. Once this was done, he said, then Spain, being a nation kept backward by the follies of her ruling class. You see, Rizal, of course, understood Spain better than any other country in the world after the Philippines. And he thought that Spain was just being very badly ruled. You have the friars here and those politicians in Spain. But if there were to be a change in the political landscape of Spain, if people who were like P. Margay and the Republicans and the socialists who were close to him, if these were the people who would be heading Spain through some kind of luck or political development, after all, there had been a revolution in 1868, why not another one? As a matter of fact, Spain really had so many conflicts, anything was possible, and unfortunately, what in fact emerged was the Civil War in the 1930s, which only showed that it was not a finished case. It was volatile, and it was still possible that some better statesmen take over. This is what he was saying. Once this was done, He said, then Spain, being a nation kept backward by the follies of the ruling class, would, for better or worse, have no other alternative but to renounce their sovereignty and recognize our independence. In this way, our independence will be legitimate and assured on a firm foundation, unchallenged, recognized by all states, but most of all, understood by its own people what independence meant. This was really what he was saying. And he is anticipating here this decolonization that happened, in fact, everywhere else, the British and decolonization. Rizal was thinking far ahead of his time, but he also saw it is not impossible that the colonial power would give up its colony because things have changed. But in the meantime, what is there to do? And this is the most important thing. Rizal's strategy in the face of inter-imperialist rivalry, international conditions adverse to armed revolution. He says, for Filipinas, meaning the Philippines, to become a nation state, build the nation first. Statehood will follow. A nation state is a composite word. It is composed of two words, nation and state. If you have only state and no nation, Rizal was saying this is going to be tyrannical. We would have deposed one tyrant and put another. Because we are not a nation aware of our rights, our responsibilities, our duties, our collectivity, our community. If you have just a state, which is nothing but an organ of power with a monopoly on power, it will just be as tyrannical as any. So build the nation state, the nation first, statehood will follow. How do you build a nation? You have to start by building up a civil society and impregnate it with a national sentiment. This was what he said to Viola. Let's build up institutions, educational institutions, all kinds of societies, and create this spirit of nationhood, of the nation that the friars are trying to prevent us from having. And his idea of civil society was La Liga Filipina. The Liga Filipina was his master plan, his organizational strategy for creating civil society, which will compose the nation and which eventually will become a nation state. I want to say this about La Liga Filipina, and of course I'm going to finish now. I think I've spent over an hour, I don't know. La Liga Filipina has nothing to do with the propaganda movement. It has nothing to do with that reformism that they were still hoping for to get in Spain. Nothing to do with Spain at all. It has everything to do with the Philippines. If you read the statutes of La Liga Filipina, there is no mention of state at all. It is like saying, let us conduct our lives, let us work together, build ourselves up, forget the state. When he says forget the state, that means, of course, forget Spain. But he's also saying, let's not even think of being a state ourselves already. We cannot do that. We cannot capture state power by revolution. But we build up civil society now. And if you look at civil society, I mean, La Liga Filipina, it is economics, it is ethics, it is culture, it is education, it is everything that is needed to build a nation. It is a cooperative movement. It is a mutualist movement from the start. I forgot to mention that in the crisis of the last century, of the 19th century, the crisis of Rizal's time, when wages were going down and agriculture was strongly affected, both in the Philippines, sugar and coffee and everything, and in Europe too. There was a very strong cooperative movement that arose in Europe and in the United States. The German farmers moved into cooperatives. That was precisely what Rizal already saw at that time. The Germans, 50% of German farmers were borrowing from cooperative banks. That was the solution to the economic problem of the economic crisis of that time. And Rizal is saying here, let us build a cooperative movement from the bottom up. His idea was that every community would have its consejo, council, and it was set up as a mutualist association, a cooperative, helping each other, protecting each other, defending each other, building each other up, creating a fund for development, and so forth and so on. I won't say anything more about that. It's a talk, a lecture in itself. But that was what it is. So finally, possible strategies and scenarios of in a period of inter-imperialist rivalry. You know how this period of inter-imperialist rivalry ended, right? It ended with the First World War, because the European countries were fighting each other all the time, competing with each other all the time. It ended up with actually a world war. Let's hope that nothing of that kind happens now, with all this talk about China and the US and Russia and everybody, because we are really precisely again in the same frame of mind. We are dealing with a very serious economic crisis, and governments don't know what to do. And here comes China, who is emerging not as an ideological rival as in the Cold War with Russia, but as an economic rival, which is where it hurts. You see, you can always say ideology, that's nonsense, that's nothing, that's atheistic, that's the work of the devil. You can say anything about ideology, but you can't do that when your rival is an economic power that's going to be stronger than yourself. That period of inter-imperialist rivalry ended in a world war. So what were these scenarios, strategies possible? Now, this is no longer Rizal. This is what we know. Two possibilities. A revolution breaks out, as in fact happened, or B, no revolution at all, which is what Rizal wanted to happen, but did not happen. If a revolution breaks out, number one possibility, demand a lot of concessions from Spain. When you have your enemy against the wall, they're bound to come up with something or a few things. Polavieja started to promise something to the Filipinos right in the first year. Primo de Rivera, who was called back to the Philippines as Governor General in 1897, he was actually saying, well, we don't believe him, but it could be a program for pursuit. He was saying, oh, we will work for your representation in the Cortes. He was saying that to the revolutionaries. Oh, is that what you want? Okay, we're going to, let's work for it. It's possible. Cuba got represented in the Cortes, but of course, you don't have the right people in government. You have to wait. Anyway, the Spaniards were beginning, of course, they were worried and they were overpowered in the Philippines. They were beginning to make concessions here and there. The other possibility, USA intervenes. But if the USA intervenes, Germany also intervenes. And this is very important because the German Navy was right here in the Philippines. They started sending their ships over. And at one time, there were even more German ships than the fleet of Admiral Dewey. And Dewey was worried about the Germans. And he was in fact saying, at one point, he lost his cool. And he said, do you want war with us? This was exactly what he said to the Germans. Because the Germans said, we are here to protect the economic and personal interests of the Germans and the Swiss and the other Europeans. They have asked us to be here to protect, because Germany at that time had something like 15 million marks of investments in the Philippines. And there were a lot of Europeans, non-Spanish Europeans in the Philippines. And Germany said, we sent, the Kaiser sent our Navy here, ready to transport the Europeans out if all hell breaks loose in the Philippines. But Spain was actually saying, intervene, help us. And the Germans, the Kaiser, actually, this mentality, he was saying, I would rather, if the colony was to fall, I would rather have the Philippines still in the hands of a monarchy than in the hands of a republic. This is the ideology of global politics. I mean, the ISER, of course, they had more identity, more sympathy for a European state under a monarch than a republic. In any case, at that time, already this was building up. Germany was very careful, but it was actually, Spain actually proposed a neutralization. They said, they were saying something like, European powers, let's jointly occupy Manila. So these are the things because revolution is already happening and Spain could not win the revolution. They knew that. They were sending over new forces, but they were sent back because they were worried that the Spanish-American War might even end up in the peninsula. So the naval forces that were supposed to come and be a decisive force to defeat the revolution in the Philippines was recalled to Spain. And remember, they had sent 200,000 people to Cuba. Spain was in no position at all to defend herself. So they said, let's might as well defend the motherland. And they turned to Germany. And Germany was tantalized because they said, Germany was really interested in the Philippines. This is a fact. But Germany was very careful because it was now the emerging hegemonic power. It was the China of that period. And everybody was just thinking that, Germany is going to cause trouble to us. And in fact, they blamed Germany for the First World War. The Philippines become a protectorate. Germany said, well, we would not be interested in being a protectorate, but maybe jointly occupy Manila. Who knows? I'm saying all this from a recently published book by a German friend of mine, Karl-Heinz Junce, who wrote the book, Germany, the Philippines, and the Spanish-American War, 4 accounts of the Imperial German Navy. And here you have precisely in the archives expressions of German interest in the Philippines and how they ended up in Manila Bay and just waiting for anything to happen. But of course, what happened is number 5. USA intervenes, or actually not just intervenes, they provoked the war in Cuba and fought and defeated Spain. Treaty of Paris, the Philippines becomes a colony, Philippine-American War, the Philippines falls under the US. In no revolution, you have one possibility. Since there's no revolution, then the Spanish-American War is confined to Cuba, not in the Philippines. Then scenario A1, concessions might be possible. We could have got the concessions from Spain. Because then they knew that the Americans are there in Cuba and they could come to the Philippines anytime. And the second one is the Spanish-American War. Whether there's a revolution or not, the Americans come over to the Philippines anyway and takes over the Philippines, and then leads to scenario A5. So that's and there just was just one last thing. Rizal said this towards the end of Filipinas Temple de Fernandez. He says, suppose these things happen, we will be with new conflicts. He says, and we are already a free people. He says, the new men, los hombres nuevos, will build their country, strengthen it with their combined forces, and set it on the path to progress. And they will fight with unspeakable ardor to defend the liberty paid for with so much blood and sacrifice. And that was the Philippine-American War. I think I'm finished here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, George, for that very informative and thought-provoking lecture. Before I call on our reactor, I would like to remind the participants again that they can write questions they want to ask our lecturer in our chat room, and we will read them after the reaction. Thank you. I now take pleasure in introducing our reactor to the presentation, Dr. Lisandro Claudio, Is currently an assistant professor in the Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies at the University of California at Berkeley. He obtained his PhD degree in Asian history from the University of Melbourne. Prior to his appointment at Berkeley, Dr. Claudio taught at the Ateneo de Manila University and De La Salle University, and was a postdoctoral fellow at Kyoto University's Center for Southeast Asian Studies. He is the author of the book, Liberalism and the Post-Colony, Thinking the State in 20th Century Philippines, which received the 2019 George McTicahen Prize from the Association of Asian Studies and the 2019 European Association for Southeast Asian Studies Humanities Book Prize. He is also the author of Jose Rizal, Liberalism and the Paradox of Coloniality, which examines how turn-of-the-century liberalism informed the birth of Filipino literature and nationalism. Please welcome Dr. Lisandro Claudio.
Maraming salamat, June, and maraming salamat to all the Knights of Rizal here, and maraming salamat as well, of course, to George. He talked about Rizal's perspicacity in terms of seeing the patterns of global history, and I must say that we see the patterns that Rizal saw because of George Aseniero's own perspicacity, and that was such a wonderful lecture. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time with my reaction. I just want to add one layer of nuance to George's lecture because my current research is really about currency. And if you look at the patterns that George is talking about in his lecture, you see these patterns as well on the level of currency policy. And this might be tedious for some people, but I'll do it really quickly. If you look at the turn of the 19th century, it is really a period of globalization under British Imperium. And Britain is the orchestrator of a new global system under the gold standard. So this was the period of the classical gold standard. But soon enough, the United States creeps into the picture. So in the mid 20th century, it is essentially the Bank of England that is running the entire world economy. But by 1873, you have the Coinage Act in the United States. And by 1890, you have the Gold Standard Act in the United States. So the United States enters the world of the gold standard. Meanwhile, and this is interesting, if you look at Spain by 1890 is the last global power that is not under gold convertibility. So it's effectively being left behind. And according to the work of Barry Eichengreen, by the late 19th century, early 20th century, if you look at the currency reserves of most major economies, the dollar has already reached the volume of the British pound, of the pound sterling. So if you look at, for example, the reserves of the German central bank, if you look at the reserves of the Japanese central bank, they're holding equal number of reserves in pound sterling and in dollars by the end of the century. So clearly there's a emergence of US power within this global context. Now, how does the Philippines fit into this story? I think it's very interesting. So in 1876, for example, you have the depreciation of the peso, actually the exit of the peso from the gold standard and its entry into a de facto silver standard, which depreciates the peso very, very quickly. And as a bit of trivia, this is the most rapid depreciation that the peso would ever see until 1970 when Marcos depreciates the peso. So 1876, no other depreciation would happen until 100 years after. But what this does is that it creates a very competitive export market because, of course, a cheap peso means cheap exports. And a lot of these exports accrue, as George mentioned, to places like Calamba and makes families like the Rizal families very, very wealthy. But of course, as George mentions, there is a crisis. And so the money that people were making as a result of silver was no longer as much as they were in the 1870s, so that when the Americans arrived, it is a period of crisis. And by 1902, you have the implementation of the US-led Gold Standard Act in the Philippines. And what must be noted about the Gold Standard Act in the Philippines, is that it is designed as the first gold exchange standard implemented by the US, but would be replicated in places like Latin America and Eastern Europe. So it was really the Philippines that began this period of a new gold standard led by the United States, taking over from the Imperium of the British. And this could, or these patterns, as George mentioned, could already be seen during Rizal's time, because you already see the accumulation of reserve currencies in various places like Japan and Germany. And so, what I want to conclude here is essentially that George is right, and that the kind of story he tells is also manifest if you look at the history of global currency, and that Rizal's life is essentially a life that begins with the Victorian period, the peak of kind of British-led globalization amid the rise of US and as the new dominant orchestrator of global capital and the global currency system. And so it's a wonderful life, and it is a life that is essentially bookended by crisis and change. And so Rizal is produced by a very interesting period, but he's an interesting person who is likewise commenting on a very interesting period. And I'd like to thank Dr. Aseniero for giving us a glimpse into these processes. Thank you.
May I?
Thank you, Dr. Claudio.
May I respond? May I respond?
Yeah,
please?
yeah.
Thank you.
We start our Q&A portion, but our lecturer can start it off by responding to the comments of the reactor.
Yeah, thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Because I'm very glad that Liloy, we call him Liloy. Yeah, I'm sure he doesn't mind, for bringing up this issue of currency. Because in fact, the Panic of '73 in Vienna was caused by Germany going fully on the gold standard and upset the financial markets, the financial system in Europe at that time. It led directly to the Panic of '73 in Vienna. And then, of course, repercussions everywhere else, eventually New York, London, and so on. That's the first thing. And then, of course, as he said, as Leroy said, Dr. Claudio said, the US then went for the gold standard. There is something here that is of relevance to the struggle for, in the debate in the United States between the pro-imperialist and the anti-imperialist league. The Philippines, the Filipino revolutionaries who wanted the anti-imperialist league in the US to win over in Washington, so that we safeguard our independence. We're counting very much on this politician, William Jennings Bryan. He was able to bring together a populist movement, anti-imperialist movement. They were all strong in opposing American continuing occupation of the Philippines as a colony. They were against that. But, and they were counting on Jennings Bryan as the spokesman, being the most articulate politician to push for this program, for this policy. Unfortunately, Jennings Bryan was interested in winning the presidency for himself. He had his own personal interest. And in that famous speech of his, you cannot sacrifice us on the cross of gold, which was all this old debate about the gold standard and silver and so on. He actually sacrificed his position, the anti-imperialist position, from his own program of action, because he thought that his chances for the election for the presidency and so on were more on the other side of this. So that's just to add to what Claudio said about the relevance of this whole issue of silver and gold in the monetary system of the world at that time, and how it got all of this thrown up in the crisis that happened. Thank you.
One sentence only, one sentence fraction. I actually found a speech wherein William Jennings Bryan effectively says, if you are against imperialism in the Philippines and against gold, you're a Democrat and you're voting for me. So these were the twin axes of the Philippines, and gold were the twin axes of his platform.
Can you say that again, please?
I'm paraphrasing. Effectively
yeah,
saying in one speech, I think it's when he's against McKinley, he says, you know, the two levers of our platform are anti-gold and anti-imperialism in the Philippines. So it is effectively the central debate of the progressive era. Gold in the Philippines.
Sir Raymond?
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Aseniero, Dr. Claudio. We have right now a couple of questions, and there's one comment as well, but I'll go on with the first one. This was actually shoot in by Gemma. Thank you, Gemma, for joining us once more. And she asks here, did any Filipino propagandist or revolutionary thinker captured the same geopolitical situation like that of Rizal? And a comment here is, I think Pasiano and Mabini, Pasiano, you know, the brother, and Mabini were also analyzing the geopolitical situation. Did Mabini think Aguinaldo declared independence too prematurely?
You want me to answer?
Yes, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Mabini was the one who really understood and wrote it down. Pasiano did not write it, so we don't know. But I mean, he did not write his thoughts on this, but Mabini did in his book, La Revolución Filipina, which was also a very strong critique of Aguinaldo, and he was, of course, criticizing Aguinaldo for so many things. But, one thing in particular was the complete misunderstanding of the international political situation. I mean, for Aguinaldo to say that, you know, we become independent under the protection of the United States, which is a contradiction in terms. And he also said, Mabini says, I wish I had written it down because I thought that might come in handy. He said something like, of course, we are wondering if the United States is not interested in the Philippines. Of course she is. She is as interested as any other power in the Philippines. But we have our interest most of all here, and we must defend it. So it was actually Mabini who understood very well the international situation. And as you know, he was brought into the revolution quite late. He had obviously his own hesitation. He probably right from the beginning understood that this was just the wrong time to revolt. It was going to be futile. We're going to lose, even if we win, even if we might win against Spain, we still will lose. And so I think he was the only one. Unfortunately, Mabini's influence was some kind of, well, personal one. He was the advisor to Aguinaldo. So in other words, he is an advisor to someone who makes the decision, not himself. And therefore, that is the shortcoming of the unfortunate situation where the man who really understood something was actually not in a position to follow through because he could only advise. And the person he was advising was not listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aseniero. We have another question here.
Can I add to that?
Yes, Dr. Kiboyan, Flora.
Yeah, I just want to add to what George said. Yes, Mabini understood, although it came a bit, he was a bit late. The first one to really see it was, as George eloquently said, Rizal. Mabini understood it, but it was sometime only in 1899. And in fact, he came out with a circular to all the revolutionaries saying, let us not be fooled by Yankee words. He made that clear. And he was already positioning himself against the position of Aguinaldo. Now, with respect to Pasiano, Pasiano did write a letter in 1899. He did write a letter to Aguinaldo. And he asked in his letter, he said, I see a number of Americans roaming around in Los Baños, in Calamba, in Los Baños, in Laguna, doing surveys and everything. They are soldiers. What should I do with them? Should I arrest them, or should I just let them be? What is exactly our official policy towards these Americans who are now roaming around Los Baños? I am ready to arrest them if you give me the go signal. That's what he said. And unfortunately, Aguinaldo did not respond to that. And in the end, of course, Pasiano ended up fighting them until the very last, when he had to surrender because he was practically left all alone and sickly and had no choice but to surrender. So even if Pasiano did not say anything in terms of writing, he did suspect. And I'm sure he was privy to the thoughts of his own brother. And
Thank you very much.
most likely, they Pasiano and Rizal talked about this when they had a reunion in Hong Kong in 1891. So Pasiano was very clear, I think, as George understood Rizal's position at that time. I think Pasiano did know that, and he did warn Aguinaldo and ask Aguinaldo for authorization to arrest the Americans, but Aguinaldo did not respond. So that's my only addition to George.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Floro. We have one question here and we are, I know we are running out of time, just a minute left, but we can have maybe 3 or so more minutes. This question is from Dr. Wayland Quintero of the University of Hawaii at Leeward. He asks, who were Rizal's influences that helped him come to these global projections? How was Rizal so aware of what was transpiring around the world in order to come to his ideas? Dr. Aseniero?
Yeah, interesting question. Because what we do know is that he was always in close communication with Blumentritt. Even when he was in the Pitan, Blumentritt was always telling him what are the conditions for a successful revolution, the conditions that must obtain if you are to start a revolution. And those conditions that he mentioned precisely refer to the external conditions, international conditions, source of farms, diplomatic support from other countries for sovereignty if you win finally. And of course his conclusion was that, but you don't have these. You don't have this. You look around and you don't have these. So better not. I mean, this was the advice of Blumentritt. Blumentritt also understood very well, but rather late in the game, like Mabini, that the United States was, Washington was going to keep the Philippines after defeating Spain and after the Treaty of Paris. And in fact, Mabini said, I wrote to the revolutionaries saying to them, don't ally yourselves with the Americans because the Americans will use you to get what they want. But he said it was too late, and his letter arrived too late to reach the revolutionaries that he was addressing himself to. So the Blumentritt certainly was one. Rizal, of course, was a very well-read, well-traveled person. So one would imagine that from his own direct observation of the countries he visited, remember he visited Japan, he visited the US, he traveled across the US. And being the very sharp observer that he was, and he read tremendously. History, when he talks about the logic of history, he saw that history is not a matter of individuals deciding this and that. It is an outcome of developments of long developments with foundations and so on, and he understood these things. So I would imagine that much of what he wrote came from his own understanding of the situation.
Yeah, thank you very much, George. We can have one final question, but before that, I would like to share here one thought from Gemma. She writes here, the Knights of Rizal should promote La Liga Filipina as the master plan for our nation. I mean, that is a very beautiful suggestion, but that's a thought. I think we will revisit that thought, Gemma. Thank you so much. The final question that we have here is, let's see here. It starts with some statements. It seems that Rizal was contemplating of a nation not as an independent one, means state, but as part of Spain, like the autonomous regions of Catalonia and Gasconia. The Spanish call them países or naciones. That's by Dr. Zayos. And the question is, may I know the opinion of Dr. Arsenio on this? George.
Yeah, he was thinking along those lines at the start when he was very much active in what we now call the propaganda movement. Certainly representation of the Spanish Cortes, extension of all the rights of citizenship to Filipinos, Philippines becoming a province. This was very much the objective of the Filipino activists, including Rizal, at that time, until he came to understand that this would not happen. That even amongst the autonomous regions of Spain, there were conflicts. How much more for the Philippines, very far away. He knew which of the political movements or parties in Spain were of this thinking, and that was precisely P.M. Margay's Federal Republicans, or Republican Federalists. If they had won, and remember that P.M. Margay was president of Spain for a few months in 1873. So it's not a pipe dream, you know. If you won it at that time, why not again, right? It was a possibility. But then they found out that it was not meant to happen. And for Rizal, the next step would be a transitional one, where, okay, we can't get what we want now, but we can get these, and why not, you know? So that was in a transitional one, but ultimately it's still independence of the Philippines. With strong loyalty to Spain, why not? As he always says so, loyal and faithful, whatever, you know, but independent, and we make our own decisions to make our own destiny. And so Rizal went through those phases, and so you are right in saying that was one phase, but very quickly he came to understand the Philippines must be on its own. And he said it in Filipinas dentro de Semanas. It is abominable, it is impossible, it is an abnormality that one people dominate another. It cannot be permitted in nature, it cannot be permitted in history, it cannot be permitted in our case.
Thank you very much, George. Thank you very much.
Can I ask the last question, Raymond? Is it possible? May time pa ba?
Yes, we are 7:06. Okay, quickly.
One last question. Yeah.
One last question.
First of all, bravo, George, for an inspired and inspiring talk. My last question is this, and it's a follow-up to what you've been saying in terms of the affinity, emotional, sentimental affinity with Spain. And I just remember that towards the beginning of the Spanish-American War, Governor Agustin, offered to unite forces with Aguinaldo to fight Spain. Now, this is the position of Nick Joaquin. And he said, had there been a concerted, had the forces of Aguinaldo united with the forces of Agustin together, resisted from the very beginning the entry of Dewey, and prevented the landing of soldiers in Luneta, I mean the Manila Bay, had that happened from the very start, that would have been the best chance for the Philippines to repel Spain, because Agustin promised everything that Aguinaldo asked for, and he said, "I'll give you everything, provided we unite forces to make sure that that the U.S. is not able to colonize the Philippines." That's a counterfactual issue, of course. But what do you think could have happened if that possibility took place?
Yeah, actually, that was also what Blumentritt was suggesting at one point, when in reference to Japan taking over Korea, that the Filipinos might better ally themselves with Spain. I mean, be together in opposing a common foe. Yeah, if a very interesting hypothetical situation. But the question there is, how determined is the US in getting it? Now, remember that tradition actually still counts. The Americans would always justify everything on ethical, puritanical, or humanitarian, now, but at that time, ethical. They justified their war against Spain over Cuba by that blowing up of Maine. I don't think they would have come so easily to the Philippines and started, shooting down Spanish vessels, because what would their justification be? They could justify it in Cuba because the Yellow Press and Hearst Empire and everything, we all know the story there. It was a tremendous build-up. The Americans were actually becoming hysterical. We have to go to Cuba to save the Cubans. That was the whole idea, save the Cubans. But the idea was, in fact, take Cuba for ourselves. In the Philippines, it might not be that easy because, they would have to blow up a ship or something to justify. But again, you don't know, because if the Americans were really so determined to get Samoa and to fight it over with the Germans, Germany was a stronger enemy to fight than Spain. But still, we really don't know, because as they themselves found out in the Philippines, it was not easy to win over the Filipinos. The Filipinos were ready to sacrifice everything. So it becomes, I don't know how to answer that question, Floro. On the one hand, if the Filipinos team up with Spain, then the Americans could not play the role of the liberator. This is the role that the Americans always wanted to play, the liberator. They continue to do that up to now. They liberate a country and leave it a mess, but they justify it as the liberator. What could be their role in the Philippines? There's nothing to liberate. The natives are fighting with the colonial powers together against a common enemy. My thoughts.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, George. Thank you very much, Laura, for that final question.
Okay, thank you, Sir Raymond. Well, it has been a lively exchange of ideas, and I think it was a productive discussion. I would like to thank our distinguished lecturer, Dr. George Aseniero, and our equally distinguished reactor, Dr. Lisandro Claudio, for this very interesting educational exercise. I would also thank our viewers for their participation in this virtual lecture. It is my hope that this lecture has given us a better understanding of who our national hero is. This ends our 7th lecture in the Rizalian lecture series, sponsored by the Knights of Rizal Aloha chapter. Tune in for the next Zoom lecture, which will be on September 25, 2021, same time. Dr. Eva Wasborn Ripolio, Associate Professor at Chaminade University, will be our next lecturer and will talk on the topic femininity in Rizal's stories. Until then, mahalo and aloha to all of you. Stay safe and take care, everyone. Bye-bye.